Today is June 21st, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here once again with my capable, wonderful podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. How are we doing, Mr. Smith?
That was such a nice intro. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I feel so good about myself. I'm doing really well. It's Friday. It's later than we wanted to get started. In fact, I might even challenge our listeners. At some point, we're going to have to pause and we'll have to come back. We have an intervening meeting, but hopefully you'll have no idea when that is. You know, you can take a guess. You can leave a comment and say, "Oh, I think it was at minute such and such." But anyway, I'm now babbling. I'm doing really well, Mr. Robinson. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, no, doing well. We have a podcast topic today that was, here's how I would phrase it. We had a recent suggestion on a podcast topic, but I would say that one is serving as a proxy for a number of other ones that had a very similar request.
Right.
Which is, in this case, talking about some of the entertainment that's out there for our kids and should be concerned. And so that's what we're hitting today. How would you describe more officially what our topic is today?
Oh, Mr. Robinson, today we're going to focus, even though, like you said, this will touch other things as well, but we're going to focus on Disney in particular. We're Americans. Disney's a big American company, but its products are shown all over the world. And Disney has taken a very dark turn. So we are going to be taking a look at the agenda at Disney and how do we approach things like this, because it will impact you one way or another, believe it or not. When you have a company as big as Disney, even if you're avoiding all their products, it's still going to make an impact. And how do we think about it biblically? How do we don't go protest, we don't do things, but still we want to see what's going on. It's definitely indicative of what's going on in our broader culture. And then how do we bring our Bible brains to the scenario?
Taking on the house of the mouse. Sounds good.
Thank you, Jake and Julia. Appreciate that music. And okay, here's what got us going on this in particular. And I think some have brought it up. It's more than once, but more than one. And by the way, saying that we cut out during the break with the music, that doesn't count, just so you know. We always do that. We're not talking about that. We're still here. So what was brought up was The Acolyte, this new Star Wars themed program on Disney Plus, the streaming network. Now, we can make really plain here. In fact, I don't even feel the need to bring out disclaimer guy. Let me just say, I am not watching that show. Now, why is that important? Because some people out there know that I grew up with Star Wars and that I've been a fan in the past of so much of that. But this is a really good example. I actively do not watch this show for reasons we're going to talk about today, among other things. I'm not interested in this show. Actually, one of my sons, when he was younger, for instance, when the Star Wars material started taking a certain turn, he was reading some of the fictional books when he was younger. And one of the books of the kind of newer series introduced a homosexual characters or something. And I credit to my son, he just closed it up and said, I'm not going to read it anymore. And he just wouldn't see them anymore. And so same thing here. So straight up, we can say, as disclaimer guy would, we're not recommending the content we're talking about today. Actually, quite the opposite. However, the content we are talking about today is being produced by one of the largest entertainment companies in existence, and Disney has only gotten larger. In fact, I heard an explanation of why they allowed their trademark on. Is it trademark or copyright? I think in this case it's copyright. It's not the names, it's the character.
Right, copyright.
I think it's copyright here. Mm-hmm. But on Steamboat Willie, the original Mickey Mouse, they actually let that pass. They let it go into public domain, which they hadn't for so long. In fact, it was Disney and their lobbyists. This is not conspiracy in any way. This is actually just news fact. They've been pressing Congress to extend all these protections because they've had such old material, and yet they let that go. And one of the analysts pointed that in a legal analysis said it's actually no wonder, because they own so much of the entertainment world now. It's not worth their while to protect something like that and to keep pressing for it. It's actually worth their while. It's cheaper for them to let stuff like that go because they're so powerful now in so many other ways. Well, we're going to focus a little bit first on what they're doing with the Star Wars franchise, but we're going to broaden as we move on. And Mr. Robinson, I don't mean to assume. Maybe you're a huge fan of this show. Maybe you're watching it every week and you're just devoted to its content because is that the case? Have you been watching the show intently?
I have not been watching the show.
No shocker.
And it's not like I have a Star Wars history. In 1978, when I was 7, my father took me to see Star Wars in the theater. They knew I would like it. And I loved it. And I cried when Obi-Wan Kenobi died. That was very traumatic to me. But it was amazing. I had never seen anything like that. Like, it felt like it was a real space battle in a real space world. Then for when The Empire Strikes Back came out, my dad took us out of school. And
really?
And took us down and we watched. It kind of makes me wonder how that fell that we were in school and he took us out instead of, maybe seeing it on the weekend. But whatever. We were excited to see it. Return of the Jedi, a little disappointing, but still a satisfactory arc. Watched the prequels. Then the sequels came out. Watched the first 2, and I still have not even seen the last one, and to have no plans to. And that isn't even necessarily agenda related. It's just, I would argue, the demise of the franchise and the end of good storytelling.
Yeah, the quality, right? Well, our listeners might be surprised. The Old Plain Truth magazine had an article talking about The Empire Strikes Back way back in 1980 when that came out. Back then, they definitely had more monetary resources to be able to show photos and things like that. Same thing for me, except it was 1977. I'm a little older than you, Mr. Robinson, but it was 77, and when the first Star Wars came out, sitting in the theater. I know now, looking at the past, that George Lucas actually paid a fine to not start the movie with credits.
Wow.
He didn't want to start with credits.
I think I've heard that.
Yeah, he begged like the Directors Guild or something like that, because he wanted the viewers to be immediately absorbed into the story with the opening crawl, just like an old classic serial.
Yeah.
So he had to pay a fine, but he was committed. He knew the experience he wanted to craft. And for 7-year-old me, it had exactly the impact he wanted. It was just it was virtually overwhelming, really, for the senses, to be in there, to start with that loud John Williams music. It was, it was quite an experience.
It was. I wondered, because I knew the movie came out in 1977 as an adult, and I wondered how I'd seen it in 78, and then went back and looked, and it had a really, really long theatrical run. I think they maybe even re-released it or something like that, which is how I saw it later than you did. But I would argue that, so back to The Acolyte, right?
Yeah, which is a new series on Disney Plus for those who don't know, right?
And I knew enough from word of mouth that it's definitely pushing an agenda. There's just no two ways about it.
Oh yeah, actively so.
But what's interesting is, talking about how I've just lost interest in the whole series, not even in many ways, not even because of the agendas they've pushed, but just it truly isn't great. Like, some of the critics of the current series are bothered more by not following canon, not following the things that have been established, doing stuff like introducing a character that wasn't even born yet, things like that.
Yeah, and it's funny. A lot of the critics that are turning on Star Wars and Disney Star Wars are people that aren't even motivated by the morals. They just looking like, wow, what is happening?
Yeah.
It's essentially
Just
you have
bad
a company that's doing its best to print money and just kind of churn out content, and that's happening in a lot of Marvel is a good example in terms of a major industry that people are warning about the quality. But what has caught our attention that we'll focus on is what is definitely a social agenda that is being pushed. That if you're going to think biblically, with a biblical brain, you have to keep these things in mind, because with Disney, it's not just an accident. And that's what's important for the podcast today, for all of our teens and young adults out there and their families listening, because as we know, some of you, in fact, we talked about doing this. Forgive me for just jumping around like a random kind of person, Mr. Robinson, but we mentioned last time, some of you have sent ideas to our email address at podcast@livingyouth.org, and that's we reached out. But then we discovered last time, and I think we mentioned on the podcast, that we didn't realize that we were not getting notified of comments on YouTube. And as a result, if you happen to watch or listen on YouTube, your comments were just disappearing, and we apologize. We've even said before, "Hey, well, leave us a comment," and then we didn't realize
nobody will talk to us.
Well, our IT team here jumped on that when they saw that, and they've informed me that they think it's fixed. They think now that if you leave a comment on YouTube, we should get some kind of notification, And we should, in fact, they've even said, hey, let us know if you don't, because they want to fix it. So we're going to ask a small favor. Not everybody has to do it. It's nothing obligatory. We're not trying to, impose upon you. But if any of you are listening on YouTube and you feel like leaving a comment, if you're willing to do that, kind of like a little roll call or something, please do on this one. Please just kind of maybe drop down and say, hey, listening in Texas or, Guadalajara, Australia, wherever it is. And maybe you're listening with your family. If so, maybe you could just let us know, that you're there. I understand it's YouTube. I'm not trying to say go out there. And it's definitely, if you're on the younger side, we have, again, teens and young adults. Don't go out there without your parents, make sure, it's okay to, to do that. But hey, we'd love to know that you're listening, and it'll be a great test, and I can let IT know that things are coming through.
It'd be really interesting to hear all the different places people are listening to us, and
it would be nice.
And it really would be very interesting for us to know how many. See, now I'm more agenda driven here, but I'm dying to know, because we hear a lot that families listen to it.
We do,
groups
right?
Of people. But then we also know, of course, people listen solo, so that'd be fascinating to hear voluntarily if you want to drop a comment.
No, yeah, it really would. So concerning The Acolyte, just to use it as an initial example to start with, and then we'll talk about some other things. But let me talk a little bit about what has come out of that program, and even though I'm not watching it, I do trust the sources that I've seen, because I've seen the clips just to verify them. And again, we're not just focusing on Star Wars. This is more symptomatic of what's going on with Disney. So on this recent series, which again we're not recommending, just get into it. There's the main character of the characters. One of the main characters is a twin. And she and her twin are essentially, I say spoiler alert, but I hope I'm not even recommending anybody watch this, but they're the offspring from a coven of witches on a planet somewhere, which Ms. Robinson noted someone's calling what do they call them?
Oh, it's a communist lesbian space witches.
That's right.
Coven.
Yeah. So anyway, because they're all women, and indeed they have two of them kind of quote unquote married. I always say quote unquote because God defines marriage, and that's not marriage. And so you have they have two mommies. Essentially, you have these two characters have two mommies, and then they use their force powers to enable a conception of these kids.
In fact, it seems there's no men at all, right? In this,
yeah, at least not in that little group of people, and also, there's one of the Jedi characters, and I've actually apparently this is also the case in a recent part of their animated show. Is a they them. So it has a they them pronoun. It's not he and it's not she. It's a they. In fact, there was I saw a tiny clip on Twitter where the main character is turning to someone else, trying to refer to someone, and says something to the effect of, well, is he or they such and such, as if, well, that's what you would say if you don't know someone's pronouns, is you kind of use different options until you know. Well, that's, it's things like that. And there's other things, but I just want to try to get as focused as I really want to move on to the rest of Disney. It's the fact that this stuff is now the norm, that these things are packed in there. They've never had to be there before, but the message that was being communicated didn't include those things. But now it does include those things. They want us to think of the world as a world in which, gender is blended, every kind of family is acceptable. There's no one way to do it, and it's broader than that. In their broader, again, just right now looking at what they're doing with the franchise Star Wars, but we'll talk a little more broadly in a moment. Back when Solo, the movie, came out, supposedly kind of an origin story for the Han Solo character, you had the Lando Calrissian character, cool, loves wearing capes, and who happens to be in a relationship with a robot of all things, right? And that's played up like, well, how does that work? Oh, well, it just works. Like, well, why? Why was that even necessary? But then you've got I think it's young adult literature. I've seen the book. I just can't remember if it's young adult literature, but it's definitely not quote unquote adult literature. You have Obi-Wan Kenobi, a classic character played originally by Alec Guinness way back in our day, Mr. Robinson, back in the original 70s and 1980 trilogy. But you have Obi-Wan Kenobi as a young learner, and he's talking with another boy, and the Jedi aren't allowed to have romantic relationships, but they're just throwing out the prospect that, he recognizes he could have a relationship with this boy, or this other boy, this romantic relationship, and it's treated like it's nothing. That's just it. It's not even treated as something different, or for that matter, even I wouldn't even say anything special. It's the quote unquote normalcy of it all. It's treated like, well, of course, he could have a relationship with this. In the other cartoon series, the Clone Wars, he actually does have a romantic relationship, platonic but romantic, with a woman that they actually named based on a character in a movie that Ewan McGregor was in. But here it's also, but no, he'd have been open to boys as well. He'd have been open to anything. And part of the insidious nature of it all is the object isn't necessarily to make it even something special, but to make sure you think this is just as normal as anything else. Mm-hmm. And what we'll talk about and we'll get to is this is not an accident. It's not even just simply, they're just reflecting fads. It is a purposeful choice that is being driven by the content creators and Disney in particular. But Mr. Robinson actually did some great research and found some really good sources about that.
Yeah. Let me dive into them, and I might make a comment on what you just said, because some of what you just said really indirectly ties into our other podcast where we talked about, how to approach, or how to say, not analyze is not the right word, but like how science fiction, how should we be thinking biblically if we read any kind of fiction, frankly, and just remember that that's how they wrote it, and it doesn't reflect real life.
Right.
And so now what's going on also, in addition, is we have these beloved characters, and a certain community just says, "Oh yeah, all those they were probably gay. They're probably gay."
Absolutely.
Despite any evidence, and especially like you pointed out to the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi had a female love interest. It just entirely made up this idea that
right,
I'll bet
and made up for the purpose of having young readers open themselves up to the idea that this is the way the world should be, that we should do that. In fact, Mr. Robinson, is where I'm going to quote Plato, who is a heathen philosopher of the past. I get this. Don't everybody think I'm going heathen. But he actually had some interesting observations. I would not agree with a lot of Plato's conclusions. But when he wrote The Republic way back when, which I did not agree with a lot of that, he actually noted that the creatives of their day, which were the poets, right? Definitely they didn't have Disney back in their day, but they had poets who would write stirring poems, the equivalent of songs here and there that would stir the people. And he was concerned because the poet isn't responsible for reflecting history. He's using his creative juices, if you will, to craft what people think based on an emotional response. And he had said once that the poet's tale can be responsible for what enters into a young person's soul and influences them. And that bothered him because there was no real commitment to truth on the part of the poet. There was rather just simply the desire for influence. He said that poetry feeds and waters the passions instead of drying them up. Poetry lets them rule. That is, your emotions rule, although they ought to be controlled if mankind's ever to increase in happiness and virtue. And that's what you have here. People recognize they can stir your emotions. They know that this is a beloved character, and they're actively using those very characters to cause you to feel a different way about things.
Let's get into a little timeline. I think this will help.
Okay, sure.
When we started putting this topic together, I had 3 questions. And the first question was, does Disney have an agenda, especially with the youth? And the answer is absolutely yes, they do.
Oh, yeah.
So then the question might be, well, what is their agenda? So let's look at a couple things. So a more recent thing was, so I would argue that the Acolyte is sort of the natural kind of, I know you can always go further, but it's kind of like the payoff or the end of the road for Disney. How did we get to where the Acolyte is so openly LGBT
Well, yeah, that's actually you had a title where someone the showrunner, the woman running
Yeah.
it,
Oh yeah,
actually
yeah. Let's
actively
get
calls
that.
it the gayest Star
Yep.
Wars.
Let's
Yeah.
let's actually. You're right. Let's hit that right
No,
now.
I just want to highlight what you're saying. That yeah, absolutely. That she said it herself that it's the gayest Star Wars they've ever made.
Yeah, I watched the video of that again this morning just to refresh my memory, and I it was difficult to watch because of how proud they were of it. But well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so there's two things I want to read to you. So you might say, well, how did we get here where they're just openly making a movie about this that wouldn't? There's still plenty of people in America that would not agree with this, and then some have pushed back. Well, you go back and you think, well, what about Elemental? That one was controversial, and Toy Story 4, okay, had something controversial. So here's from, I guess this is an entertainment website, Screen Rant. They talk about this kind of stuff all the time. So here's their title. It's what passes for an article. Elemental's Lake, how Pixar introduces its first non-binary character. Of course, non-binary means it's neither male nor female.
Yeah, someone that doesn't someone that doesn't identify with male or female, right?
Pixar's history of LGBTQ plus representation goes all the way back to 2016, where it introduced its first lesbian couple in Finding Dory. 3 years later, in 2019, Pixar pushed the envelope a little further by introducing its first lesbians of color in Toy Story 4, in a fleeting scene where the two mothers interact with their son. Onwards, because that's the title of it, Onwards, Cyclops cop Spectre was Pixar's first official lesbian character who still had relatively less screen time, but showed how Pixar was gradually progressing with the LGBTQ representation. After Onward and before Elemental, 2022's Lightyear was the first Pixar film to feature same-sex kiss between Hawthorne and her female partner. Now, that's 8 years ago, right? So you could see, at least for some time, that was going on. But
yeah, 2016, 8 years ago,
yeah.
right?
I have another article here that says it goes much further than that. From The Atlantic. What is The Atlantic? Was originally a magazine.
Actually, it's a relatively liberal magazine. Yeah, it's a secular magazine.
Here's their title. It's not just Frozen. Most Disney movies are pro-gay. The culture warriors have decided Disney's Frozen is queer.
Oh, can I pause you just for a second and make sure that that the word queer used to be considered, is that an iffy word?
Mm-hmm.
But I hope our listeners understand that, no, it's a mainstream culture word now. And actually your teachers in the schools who understand it. It's used in academia, and it means even more than say homosexual. It means trying to take all these things that we would consider, frankly, perverted and perversions of what God's made, and make it where there is nothing that's normal. Everything is kind of open. The idea of quote unquote queering things is just that. And so when we say that, I remember I used to feel bad as a kid, saying this particular word, but now I realize, no, it's being said frankly on news programs, and it's pretty normal. So I thought I'd throw that out there for those that might be surprised.
And it also, as I recall, when it was used pejoratively when we were growing up, it didn't mean just merely somebody who was attracted to a member of the same sex. It had the idea of being off, something not right, a little funny.
Well, that's the origin of the word, right? It used to be someone just say, "Oh, well, that's rather queer," and they would just mean strange. And if it's anything, it's kind of gone back to that. But now it definitely includes homosexuality. It really means not biblical, but not traditional, but especially in matters of sex and gender.
I also might point out as we read this excerpt from this article that it's the culture warriors have decided that the protagonist in Frozen is probably gay. It's not even Disney themselves in this case actively saying that she was. It's just what they're extracting out of it. Okay, so here's why. Elsa hiding her ice powers could be read as a metaphor for the closet. The Oscar-winning "Let It Go," the song, plays like a coming-out anthem, and a character in the film evokes the question of whether homosexuality is a choice by inquiring of Elsa's powers, born with it or cursed. Some liberals have praised the film for its subtext. Some conservatives have denounced it, but there's more. But the most remarkable thing about queer readings of the film may be how unremarkable they really are. Through both its corporate practices and content in its film, Disney for decades has implemented the so-called gay agenda, which is to say, help make the world a more accepting place. So I have one more paragraph. But so, does Disney have an agenda to influence your kids? Yes, they do. To start, in the most obvious place, as a business, Disney has long held a progressive attitude toward LGBT people. Gay pride events have been hosted at Disney World since 1991. And the company started offering its gay employees health insurance benefits for their partners since 1995, a decision that wasn't entirely popular back then.
Yeah, I remember hearing about those events way back when, and being, even then, I mean, just appalled. Like, you got to be kidding! You can have an entire corporation set aside a day, to especially really honor, if you will, homosexuality. But yeah, the idea that this is something new, it's more, the only thing that's really new is how blatant and forward it is.
Yeah.
And how, frankly, it's embraced as something we don't even have to hide this. Let's be upfront. We are trying to teach your kids to accept these things, because I think what's happened, and we will get into what the Bible says about these things, is that the culture of values has shifted so that they've gone from being fringe and simply seen as bad, but trying to overcome that, to now actually seen as virtuous. We are the virtuous people in this environment, and so they're happy to proclaim it and happy to be able to open, like, yeah, we want your kids to think this way.
So and how do we know that? Well, there was a Zoom meeting. It's kind of in the latter, kind of the aftermath of COVID. So that's why there was a lot of video meetings. And so it's important to know, well, it's good to know that there was something going on at the time. So Disney is located in Florida. And in 2022, Governor DeSantis, who's the governor of Florida, was passing, or had passed, I think he was trying to get it passed, a bill that would basically forbid schools to be bringing in gender ideas or to kids. I mean, like elementary school, first, second grade.
Don't go around trying to teach children all of these different sexualities and
it's
stuff.
like, even then, I remember at the time I was like, I think it only affected kids, say 10 or younger, which is at least a start, and that's something.
It was relatively limited.
Yeah, it was pretty limited. And so Disney had decided that they were going to fight this because they are there in Florida, and went after it. And so some of what was going on is in juxtaposition to that bill being passed. So Disney's openly against that. They don't want it. And so somebody leaked a Zoom meeting that was quite revealing. Now, I got this information I'm going to read to you now from I'm sure at one point it was a magazine, but it's probably just a website now, called The Advocate. And The Advocate is not a conservative organization.
No, it's definitely pro-homosexual.
Yeah, it's very pro-homosexual. So here's from their comments about this.
That's part of the point. We're trying to say they're not. This isn't some conspiracy idea. Yeah. They themselves are saying this. They're happy about this.
Animation director LaToya, we're saying Raveneau. We don't know 100%.
Say Raveneau. Yeah,
Raveneau. LaToya Raveneau, a director on shows including The Proud Family, was depicted in the video. This is the Zoom meeting. In it, she described feeling concerns when she first worked at Disney because she heard rumors the company played it too safe with content. And they're talking about gay content.
But now they're quoting her.
But then my experience was bafflingly the opposite of what I had heard. And then further down, she also said, oh yeah, because this is in the juxtaposition again of that Florida parent bill, right? LaToya Raveneau says her team has implemented a not at all secret gay agenda and is regularly adding queerness to children's programming. And then one of the other people leaked in that Zoom, somebody, let's see, what did they say she is? A corporate president of Disney, Carrie Burke, says, as the mother of one transgender child and one pansexual child, she supports having many, many, many LGBTQIA characters in our stories and wants a minimum of 50% of characters to be LGBTQIA and racial minorities.
Right, and I want to highlight that the phrase, I was just double checking, where she says the not at all secret gay agenda. She herself said that. This is my not at all secret gay agenda. She's being very open about that. And I'm so glad you put it in the political context at the time, because clearly the idea that these things should not be pressed on children was at issue, because you had Governor DeSantis who was pressing for this legislation, and Disney was fighting back. And so you have them kind of very proudly pushing back and trying to say, you know what? No, we do have an agenda. We do want to do this. One of the things she said in that meeting also that I found in the New York Post, and I remember seeing the clip back then as well, is she said, this is a quote from her. She said, "I was just wherever I could adding queerness. No one would stop me, and no one was trying to stop me." So here she is, frankly admitting to all of us. And let me say, I hope she wouldn't be taken aback by the fact that I'm quoting her. I hope she's just as, plain today. That, no, this is me. What is her words? Wherever I could. Wherever she can, she's seeking to add queerness into the content. So that's, you say it's an admission, but when someone's so proud of it, is it really an admission? I'd say it's just a bold claim of a fact. Like, you bet that's exactly what I'm doing. So do understand, this is actively going on. And now this is Disney. It is broader than Disney, but there's a reason we're focused on Disney. And it's actually, I would say it's not really, oh, you know what? Oh, there's one more quote from the article in the Atlantic you have at the very bottom. I don't know if you were saving it, but I really do like it. This is from the same Atlantic article. By the way, and I messed up the title, the impact of all that, because I added other content. It was so great what you were doing. I'll just repeat the title. It's not just Frozen. Most Disney movies are pro-gay. That was the title. And the Atlantic, they wrote this: by preaching acceptance and questioning gender, the companies, that is Disney's kids films, offer a queer studies crash course. This is the Atlantic. This is a secular magazine. If anything, they're not bashing this. They're just stating the way they see it. And they're saying, you know what? Disney is giving your children, and aren't you happy about this? They're giving them a queer studies crash course. That is, they're intensely, what is a crash course? Where you're learning something intensely, you're learning it suddenly, it's coming at you a million miles an hour because you got to do it in a little bit of time. And they're doing their best to invest in your kids a queer studies crash course. And what is queer studies? If you were to go to a college and try to major or something in queer studies, it is that very thing. It is the studies of how do we take in fact, please watch our DVD about the transgender problem, the one that we put together. It's all new material. It's not old telecast. Queer studies is the discipline where they're really trying to look at society and figure out how can we make more people be open to all of these lifestyles, and how can we help quote unquote people not to think of heterosexuality as normal. How do we help them not to think as a mother and a father as normal? The whole one of the supports for the Drag Queen Story Hour. Mm-hmm. It's a queer studies kind of thing. How do we help? How do we use Drag Queen Story Hour to help children know that they should ignore these borders, and they do it to be actively transgressive? And so this is the Atlantic, they're not trying to court controversy. They're just out there just saying, hey, boy, isn't this great? Here's what Disney's doing.
Yeah. It's the kids are so very, very vulnerable. Well, I mean, like, I remember when I was 15 and I wasn't too bright. I had a lot to learn about the world, let alone kids that are under 10 who use play and their imagination as a way to process the world and learn about it. And when you kind of shortcut that circuit or take advantage of that circuit, that might be a better way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
By putting and how do you attract kids? Colorful things. There's the gender unicorn with rainbows coming out of it. It's all appealing to the kids, and they don't understand that it's not good for them. And they're just using all the hallmarks of how you would attract a kid's attention, and that's what they're using through all especially their animated stuff. I guess no, Disney does a lot more than just animated. Okay, sorry, had to recalibrate the brain there.
Yeah.
But we've come a long way from Pinocchio and Cinderella, which I would say objectively had a lesson to be learned for kids that was appropriate.
Well, they did Pinocchio about not lying, and by the way, we're not trying to say that what Disney was up until recently, a completely innocent company, that it never did anything wrong. No, in fact, if one of the things, it's kind of subtle in one of the comments that Ms. Ravenel says, and it's actually not something we copy, but if I recall, I read it in one of the articles where she was saying that there were things where someone might suggest, oh, we can't do that here or there from kind of old things. But, and I could be wrong, but I think the implication was that some of them may have wanted to do some things, but they just couldn't because they knew it wouldn't sell, or they knew that it wouldn't come across. But look, there's been perversion in the arts forever, right? In fact, I remember talking with, it was another minister or someone, kind of speculating, why is that? What is the appeal of the arts? And I would think that part of the appeal of the arts to those who are more interested in, let's just say perversion, is that it's celebrated in some of the arts to push boundaries, to be a boundary pusher. And when it comes to the arts, the boundaries can be technical. They can be in the technique you use, but just kind of like old pagan Plato noticed, the poets were interested in manipulating the values of their listeners by appealing to their emotions. And all the more if you're really drawn to pushing boundaries that have to do with value and have to do with seeing the world the way you see it and say it the way other people do it, well, then the arts are a natural place, a natural kind of gathering place for individuals like that. But that's the difference. In the past, even if there were those of ill-formed character who were a part of, say, the art house in Disney, well, at least they felt some pressure to keep that to themselves, or felt some pressure not to make things that relate to that. Now it's the opposite. It's not just that the doors are open. They're literally encouraging going through those doors to try to put as much forward as they can, to the point that I didn't watch it because it just in the end didn't seem appealing, let alone once I knew more details. But there was a animated movie that came out. It wasn't Pixar, but it was digital Disney. Which is kind of weird. They have two houses like that. I don't know if that's why that is. I think I read about it, but it was I think it's called Strange Planet or Strange World. I think it should have been a big splash, but it kind of wasn't, and it really did not perform well, if I recall. But in it was like a guy and his son, and they discover like this really strange world, I suppose, and it's already, things are kind of weird. But he has like a son who has a romantic interest in another boy, and it's not like even side characters. They're like main characters. And it's kind of, and I think the dad even tries to give him advice or something about how to approach this boy, and that's part of the insidious nature of it. Again, it's treated as just normal. Like there's nothing outstanding about it. And while they might say, well, this is about representation, we just want people to see themselves represented in our work. When you look at it, by far, it is beyond representation, because if you actually look at the numbers of those who are actually, say, quote unquote, transsexual, well, now I'd say there's by far more Jedi who are than actually in the normal population. It's beyond that. These people essentially are saying we have an agenda, and it is to help, quote unquote, help children embrace these things and make them a part of their life as well.
So we see an agenda that's designed to take things that we would call, tell me if this is too strong, that's trying to normalize deviant behavior.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is.
So it's trying to normalize that to your children, and it's not limited to Disney. Large corporations are promoting this in their own ways. Now, there was some pushback on it last year. Like Target kind of got the target of the ire of some people, right? But, it's even codified, and like everything ends up being tied back to money. Oh, you need to borrow some money so you can build a new store. Well, are you following our ESG guidelines? Because it kind of spells out how your behavior should be and what you should be promoting. And it feels like some level of this is becoming, help me come up with the correct word for systematized. Like it's,
oh yeah, that sounds good. Right.
There's this whole push of behavior that would never be considered normal is being pushed out onto our entire nation. It's permeating our nation. Now, not everybody, because there's definitely a divide in the U.S. for sure. But is there anything Can you think of anything in the Bible, like somebody like Isaiah, maybe anything that he said in describing the time period we would live in?
That's so funny, Mr. Robinson. Sometimes I feel like this is the closest thing I get to football and being Harrison Butker, where Mr. Robinson has just set the football on the ground so we can rub and kick it. Absolutely, Mr. Robinson. And two particular verses come to mind. One characterizing the time in which we live, and then one warning us. I'm not saying there's not other verses that might come to play, but these are at least two we want to definitely leave you with on the podcast. The first one, in terms of characterizing exactly what the attitude Mr. Robinson was just talking about, you find in Isaiah 5:20, and it characterizes our time, but it also characterizes God's attitude about it. And in Isaiah 5:20, we read, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness before light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And that is exactly what's going on. And let me say, if I need to take some edge off of this, some of these individuals that are really pressing for this, they truly are deceived. I mean, they really do think they're doing a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
They really think that they're improving the minds and the, if you will, spiritual lives of children by doing these things. But that doesn't actually mean it's true. That just speaks to how deceived and messed up our generation has become. And God says, woe to those who take something that's evil and they call it good, or take something that's good, like say pushing back and saying, hey, I don't want my kids to learn this, and then actually calling that evil, which they do. They would say, well, if you don't want your children to learn this, you must be a bigot.
You highlight that idea in your New Gods, New Sins article, right? Or at least the concept of it?
I think so. I definitely talk about social engineering in the New Gods, New Sins one, which, by the way, if you haven't seen the New Gods, New Sins telecast, the graphics they did for that one I thought were really cool. And then we did an article about it as well. So yeah.
Sorry to break your train of thought, but
hey, you're advertising a telecast. That sounds great.
Things that we, like many generations, would be considered, say, moral. I mean, not even just the modern Western civilizations, like other cultures, now is behavior that in our modern era is now considered. No, not only is that not a moral that we follow, you're actually wrong because you're.
Yeah, not just, well, hey, you just differ from me. Let's all, no, it's like, no, you actually need to be you need to shut up because I'm helping children and you're just making them more bigoted.
And you're practicing hate.
Yeah, so keep in mind, our teens and young adults listening and the parents who of our teens and young adults, that we're living in a day and age when increasingly people call evil good and good evil, and you cannot take it for granted that just because it's a treasured show you've long enjoyed, that it's not going to be changing. The individuals involved have their ideas, and some of them think they're doing it. Some of them are doing it because they think it's a moral good. They're wrong, but they think that. And then others, it's straight up about the money. Mr. Robinson mentioned ESG scores, these kind of social scores that are starting to fall out of favor with some, where companies would be reported in certain rating systems if they had things like this in place that were very, say, pro-LGBTQ, et cetera. But also, and this is important speaking to you as young people, there are a lot of, say, studies out there here and there that show younger generations care about this, and they care about their friends, which they should care about their friends, but caring about your friends also, was the proverb say, the wounds of a friend are faithful, right? That, yeah, we should care about our friends that are caught up in deviant behavior or delusions, but not, and therefore accept it, but rather care and hope that they would change. So they have studies, well, they corporations often follow the money, and us older people, we don't have as much spending power as we used to have. It's they're looking increasingly to what younger people want to spend money on, because that's the future wallets. That's not just today's money, that's tomorrow's money. Versus older people, it's just today's money. It's not tomorrow's money. And so they're going to increasingly aim these things because they think this is what young people want to see. They want to see all this kind of radical, different kind of approaches and ideologies. So anyway, regardless, you cannot afford to be a lazy consumer of anything anymore. Like I mentioned in a sermon this weekend, your brain, your mind, just like your body, you are what you eat. And you might think it doesn't make much of a difference. You might think, oh, I know, I filter all that out. But honestly, kind of like what Plato saw with the poets, it doesn't have to be just one poem. It's the the analogy, I'm probably being too artful by half, but you might see a trickle, a consistent trickle of water on a stone, and think, oh well, that's just water. The stone is so tough. The water's just rolling off of it. But give it enough time, that water will cut a giant cleft through that stone. So it's the constant coming at you with these things that does start to make a difference. But also, therefore, what do you do? Well, I really felt that 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33 spoke to this. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33, Paul says, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. And you might think, oh, well, that's why I surround myself with good friends. That's why I listen to great podcasts, like the one with Mr. Robinson, Mr. Smith. Okay, that's fine. But in a sense, right now, you're listening to us. You are making company of me and Mr. Robinson. You're inviting us into our home, into your home, to talk about things, or maybe it's your car, or wherever you're listening to us. Well, same thing. When you watch these movies, you're inviting those people into your home. You're not only spending time with them, you're sitting quietly while they talk for an hour or 2 hours or half an hour, whatever it is. And the Apostle Paul literally prefaces his statement with the words, do not be deceived. Why? Because it's easy to fool ourselves into thinking this doesn't affect me. This is not going to affect me. I know right and wrong. This isn't going to bother me. It's not going to affect me. But yet the point still is present. Evil company corrupts good habits. Do not take it for granted for yourselves, for the young adults out there who either are thinking of of having children or already have children. Don't think it doesn't affect your kids. I've heard from a number of parents surprised by what their young children come home from school saying.
It sounds like we're concluding, although I think that's become a meme in our podcast.
To say that and not conclude.
But it looks like we're, I mentioned earlier in the podcast when I was trying to make sense of this topic, it's one thing to have an idea that you want to talk about this. It's another to organize the information.
Yeah.
And so the questions I asked were, does Disney have an agenda? Yes, they do. How are they getting their agenda across, or what is their agenda and how are they getting it across? Well, we've read to you today that they have we'll just call it a gay agenda, and that they're promoting it first very subtly and now very openly. And they're doing it through entertainment. And it's a great way if young kids who don't have enough experience, frankly, they'll take it in and it will influence them. But then the third thing was, these people that are promoting it, how do they feel about it? Well, we literally call all of June now Pride Month. And it reminded me of Isaiah 3:9. And I might even have, I like, there's another translation I might read it to you as well, because it helps make it just adds a little to it. Isaiah 3:9, the look on their countenance witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. Another translation has, the look on their faces testifies to their guilt. Like the people of Sodom, they openly boast of their sin. Woe to them, for they are bringing disasters upon themselves. So we've gone from a culture where most people recognized, let's be very, very kind and say that's probably not a great lifestyle. And those who did it felt some shame and hid. The culture did not accept it. But starting in the 90s, like when did it start? Well, it started by degrees for a long time, but the 90s really, especially the latter half of the 90s, really started to normalize it. And it started to become you had like a show like Will and Grace. It had a recurring homosexual, well, that was
main
couple.
character.
Yeah. Main character and side character. Like that. And you just began, like, if you're going to watch any TV, and what does this say? You kind of had to expect and accept that there was going to be a gay character on it.
Yeah.
And now here we are. It's just out there and in the open, and nobody tries to hide it. The not so secret agenda, as we read
as you
later,
said, yeah.
it's just wide open. So, Mr. O'Gwyn from time to time would say, "Hey, do you want to know where we are in the prophecy?" Well, I think some of these scriptures kind of testify to where we are in prophecy.
Smith and Robinson.